Okay. All right, Hillsborough County. In Hillsborough County, there have been glitches after glitches in the voting systems. In 2006, there was one. In 2008, there was a serious glitch. And in 2010, there were 38,000 ballots rescanned in the middle of the night using poll workers at the Falkenberg Road location at the annex of the Supervisor of Elections office. Okay, the glitch was never really explained. It affected 38,000 ballots, and so the poll workers, and you got to wrap your mind around this, in the middle of the night, fed the ballots, took them to the Falkenberg Road annex, fed the ballots back into the machines by hand. Okay, and that was called a glitch. Alright, Dominion Voting System said it's hard to figure out. Robert Pickett of Dominion. We decided that it was best to run the ballots again. It's from Tampa Bay Online, November 3rd, 2010. And my question is, we decided, since when does a corporation run the election? Alright, and as you're going to see, that the corporations have a tie-in to the elections offices and the officers, which is quite unseemly. Okay. Out of 70,000 early voted ballots in the last 3 days of early voting, 38,000 glitch ballots represents 54% of the last 3 days of early voting. According to news reports, they came from Temple Terrace, New Tampa, West Tampa, South Shore, and Jan Platte communities. Temple Terrace is perhaps the largest African American community, contiguous African American community in Hillsborough County. University of South Florida is adjacent with 38,000 undergraduates and roughly 9,000 graduate students. It is essentially a part of the Temple Terrace community. Okay, Jan Platte community, you see it there on the left. That's a poll. That's actually an elections worker, one of the political parties running around trying to get registered people to vote. It's modest. It's middle class to lower income. West Shore, middle class. Okay. West Tampa, again, middle to lower income, and we see here some short sales going on, and Town and Country also. These are all from the real estate mags of the properties for sale and for short sale and so forth in these communities. These aren't wealthy, affluent areas, although they have some areas in there that are nicer than others, but on average, these areas are not wealthy. They're lower to middle income at best. Okay, Temple Terrace is a very strong African American community. This is Reverend Wright. Appears at a church there in Temple Terrace frequently. People in Temple Terrace, they frequently, during the election season, they will go to church on that last Sunday before, and they will go to early voting on that Sunday. University of South Florida, you have to go there to get the scope of the size and the scope of the complete reach of that university and how many people are involved in that university. There's a lot of students there, and guess which way they vote. Now, I-4 is key to every election in the state of Florida, and of course, all the communities mentioned are at the end of the I-4 on the Tampa side, and I-4 is key to that election because I-4 is family land. It's middle class to low income, and that it's the main battleground for the state of Florida, and there are 29 electoral votes. Okay, so if we have a problem with our elections, who are you going to call? The Secretary of State should have the answers. His name is Kurt Browning. Secretary of State Kurt Browning, hired by Rick Scott following a 6-month quote retirement. Okay, Secretary of State Browning. He was originally hired as Secretary of State in January 2007 by Charlie Crist. Scott announced his campaign for governor April 10, 2010. Browning resigned from Charlie Crist's team on April 30, 2010. Rick Scott was elected 2010. Browning hired back by Rick Scott January 2011. Browning was absent during the time the previously mentioned report was sent to his interim Secretary of State, Roberts. Okay. The way it went with Kurt Browning, to me, it is suspect. He was 26 years supervisor of elections of Pasco County. He was Florida's Secretary of State following the election of Charlie Crist. Again, if Florida's next governor decided to rehire him in January, Browning would have been eligible for his $450,000 pension and his salary. And that's just what happened too. When he got it, he became a double dipper. He got the job, became a double dipper. Okay? People didn't trust Wernher von Braun when he first came to NASA because he was from the Adolf Hitler administration. But his skills with rocketry were such that we just had to have him. The potential for mischief and wrong comes from the technology itself put into the wrong hands. It turns out Wernher von Braun adopted this country and did his best for this country, and the technology that was placed into his hands didn't end up anywhere else. You have to wonder, does Browning have the best interests at heart for the state of Florida? Because he is a wizard. He's a technological wizard, and he knows these machines backwards and forwards better than people all around him. He's very competent. But, you know, he was a fan of touchscreen voting. Touchscreen voting is very suspect. These wonderful machines provide no written record for vote verification. No matter, Browning was all for it. Here he is as Pasco supervisor of elections with one of his favorite machines, the iVotronics by ES&S. I say his favorite machines because he was the head of the users group for supervisors of elections for ES&S machines. He knew all about them. Browning was a major proponent of touchscreen voting, and here he is demonstrating his baby, the ES&S iVotronics. Okay, fast forward 6 years. Sarasota County, 2006, District 13 congressional race, Christine Jennings versus Vern Buchanan. The matter was decided by 369 votes, despite the fact a record number of undervotes, nearly 18,000, were recorded on the iVotronics touchscreen system. Now, if you look on the ballot on the right, we just keep mashing on the button and nothing happens. It's Buchanan on top, Jennings on the bottom. They just kept mashing that button, and something was wrong. Hundreds of people recorded that, you know, they could not make their vote for Christine Jennings register. So you have to ask what the story was with that. We ended up with Vern Buchanan still in Congress, still being investigated off and on since 2006, allegedly skirted campaign finance laws by forcing employees, coercing his employees to donate to his campaign, allegedly. He's listed as one of Cruz's most corrupt congresspeople. Okay. Our sordid history of electronic voting. In 2000, GS&S voting machines, as said, counted backwards for Gore 16,022 times in Volusia County. There was never an explanation why this happened. Our attention was diverted by talk of hanging chads in Palm Beach County. GS&S was acquired by Diebold ATM maker in 2004-2005. A journalist named Bev Harris was given a tip that Diebold's GEMS software, acquiring right along with the GS, was visible in a number of files on a website server on the internet. So you have the actual programming available. Harris downloaded all their files overnight. She turned the files over to computer experts who easily exploited loopholes in the software. In 2006, my dog continues to bark there. In 2006, a software engineer from Finland discovered that GEMS software on vote count. He discovered the GEMS software on vote counting cards by Diebold could indeed count backwards, and so he hacked a vote on camera using Diebold machines in front of Leon County Supervisor of Election Ion Sancho. The hack is now world famous as the Hursty hack. Okay, there is no reason on earth, if you think about this, there is no reason on earth for vote tabulating software to ever count backwards. There's really no reason for it, unless the objective is to steal elections over and over. The same software, GEMS, was used in the election of Rick Scott. Okay, corporate blood trail. 2009, Diebold changed the name of their voting machines divisions from Diebold Election Solutions to Premier Elections. During this time, they acquired ES&S and then sold ES&S to Sequoia. Sequoia was bought and sold. In essence, what you have is just a rolling smorgasbord of the same three players: ES&S, Sequoia, and Diebold. And in 2010, Diebold sold Premier to Dominion Voting Systems. Okay, so let's go through that again. Diebold changed their name of their voting machines divisions to Diebold Election Solutions, from Diebold Election Solutions to Premier Election Solutions. So they were distancing themselves from the Hursty hack, from blackboxvoting.org, from the movie Hacking Democracy. So they were trying to get away from it. But merely changing their name didn't work. So they then sold to a company called Dominion, which is originally a Canadian company. It's now based in Denver. Essentially, a biopoly exists in the market now. Dominion and Sequoia. Those are the two big players. Following the election of Rick Scott, the Hillsborough County Supervisor of Election, confirmed to me that Dominion was still using GEMS, the same software that tabulated votes backwards for Gore in 2000. They're still using the same software. It's named the same thing. There might be different versions of it. There might be patches. But when I asked this gentleman, can the software still count backwards, he didn't give me an answer. Alright, the weirdness at Hillsborough SE, Supervisor of Elections. So I interviewed the Hillsborough Supervisor of Elections, three top guys. Hillsborough SOE Earl Leonard, he's the supervisor, the elected, well, not the election official, but the appointed official. The MIS director, Tim Bobanek, pretended to neither have heard of the Hursty hack nor the loophole in GEMS for vote counting software enabling backwards counting. Earl Leonard, who is the supervisor of elections, took me into a room where the votes were counted or rescanned during the election. He claimed the rescanned ballots occurred during the primary between Rick Scott and Bill McCollum. In any case, he said the recounting was all done by 10:30. But the record vastly differs. Okay? As of 11:30 p.m., a team of about a dozen election workers were still busy scanning ballots with about 10,000 uncounted for ballots remaining. Tampa Bay Online, Dateline, 11:57 p.m. So on two fronts, he's lying to me. On the one front, it wasn't done by 10:30. It was still going on at midnight. On the other front, okay, this happened during the general election. This didn't happen during the primary. There was a midnight rescanning during the general election. Okay? You know, I'm standing there with Tim Bobanek. I'm standing there with Earl Leonard and another gentleman who we'll talk about in a little bit, and they didn't correct him when he said this. And they all know it happened during the general election. They said a central vote tabulating machine coded the memory cards. The cards were sent to the early voting places, but on election night or primary night, as they maintain, I suppose, when the vote totals were tabulated to be sent over a secured network, they discovered they didn't download. So they took out the physical ballots and rushed them to the Falkenberg Road Annex and manually fed 38,000 ballots back into the machines. All better? Okay. Standing to my right was Craig Latimer, Chief of Staff, and Tim Bobanek, the IT guy. Neither men corrected Mr. Leonard. Mr. Leonard further mentioned difficulty in the county vehicles. The significance of this didn't hit me until later. Without correcting their boss as to the day of the vote, the men didn't mention the rescan ballots came about. They did mention the rescan ballots came about because of memory cards failed to download properly. Oddly, these cards again went out to the 5 early voting places, most notably Temple Terrace, USF, and Environs. As again said, USF has 38,000 undergraduates, 9,000 graduate students. And guess which way a lot of them vote. Okay. Bobanek said the machine that coded the cards was defective and was sent back to Dominion Voting Systems for an investigation. That is to say, when you start the election process, you put all the codes for counting the votes on the memory cards. That code runs through a tabulating machine to receive that code and put it onto the card. They said the machine that did that malfunctioned. So this is a year ago, right? And they sent that machine back to Dominion Voting System. And there has been no word in a solid year as to what that malfunction was all about. To this day, these words, these romper room words, glitch, problem, and defective, remain officialdom's explanation. No report, no nothing. Silence. Okay? Let's look at the numbers. By the numbers, we have Rick Scott, 49%, 2,619,335 votes. You have Sync at 2,557,785 votes. Okay, the total voter turnout, and counting everybody, is 5,359,735. Okay, so kind of remember these numbers. This came from the actual Department of State. These figures are as hard as they can get, in that the Department of State gave them to us, and we have to, I suppose, we have to depend on their counting, even though in this case, obviously they're in error. In Perato, BEM, at 13,690 votes does not equal 0.3%. It can't if Arthur and Cluck at 18,644 is also 0.3%. So something, I mean, we have to depend on their numbers, even though in this case they're obviously wrong. Okay, assuming 38,000 votes were votes for Sync. Okay, so let's start out. Total voter turnout, there again, 5,359,735. The difference between Sync and Scott is 61,550. The percent difference, and you look at it there, is 1.15%. That's the difference between the two votes. Okay, you take 61,550, divide by 5,359,735, and you multiply by 100. It's 8th grade math. That gives you a percent of 1.5 difference between the two. Now, over here on this side, in Florida, if there is a difference between the top two candidates of less than 0.5%, a recount of a starting 3% sample ballot is the first step toward a possible total recount. And it isn't just prescribed, it's mandated by law. Okay, so you have to do that. If you end up within 0.5% difference between the two top candidates, you have to have first a 3%, and then if that's still screwy, you have a total recount. Alright, so now, assuming these 38,000 votes, let's pretend that we know these 38,000 votes were stolen from Sync and given to Scott. So let's see what would happen. So if we gave them back to Alex Sync, okay, that's 61,550 minus 38,000. We have a 0.44% difference between these two candidates. And that is a recount. Even if you added 3,215 votes again back to Scott, okay, which is a little, we're talking a little under 10%, you'd still be inside the 0.5% difference between the two that demanded a recount, at least of a 3% sample ballot. Okay, the odds? Obviously the odds against a random number of 38,000 eclipsing the need for a recount out of 5 million ballots are dauntingly dubious, to me, anyway. The odds against this happening are pretty stacked against, okay? It can be argued someone held back 38,000 ballots from registering, from taking, from counting late in the evening as the vote totals were coming in. The vote was hacked, the ballots were swapped out amid all the driving around, thus preventing a recount if not flipping the result. Okay, it can be argued, and there's Sherlock Holmes off to the right arguing the point. Okay, let's go back for a moment. In 2007, following the disgrace in Sarasota County, the legislature and the governor agreed a paper trail was needed, despite the urgings of Kurt Browning that we all should have complete touchscreen systems, no paper trail, so that all touchscreen systems were replaced with optical scan machines. You often hear in the nomenclature OSX. Okay, that means you mark a ballot with a pen. This is counted by a scanning machine, much like a barcode reader. But the software inside, as said before, It remains the same. It's the same software. So if you hack a vote, you'd want to swap out the ballots so that your bogus, hacked, and stolen election matches the dots on the paper trail. That's how simple it is. You got to swap those ballots out, because in 2007 the state made you go through that extra step if you want to steal an election. Okay? This is what a recount looks like. This is the 2007 recount. Alright, the green arrows all point to observers who are surrounding the canvassing board, which is in the midst of the recount, and the red arrows as far as we can tell. Okay, so look at all the observers and look at the workers, and you also have, among that crew of observers there, you have citizens and you have the press. Alright, the whole country was watching, if we can remember back that far. New York Times was on this because these two, Jennings Buchanan, were fighting for a seat vacated by Katherine Harris, who was a very public figure at that time. The Sarasota experience taught us one thing: recounts are visible affairs, very public. There's a canvassing board comprised of the supervisor of elections, the county commission chairperson, and a circuit judge. Members of the press and the Republic are invited to witness the recount start to finish, and these recounts can take 1 day or longer. What is a rescanning? Okay? There are no laws on the books governing a proper handling of a rescanning. The SEO, the supervisors of elections, can handle them however they see fit. In the case of Hillsborough County, there was no canvassing board per se. Earl Leonard said no one from the county commission was there as members of the canvassing board, as they were all out campaigning until the last minute for their parties. This is what the rescanning looked like. Can you see the difference? You have poll workers. In the news article they said probably more than a dozen, manning optical scanning machines, feeding previously voted, in quotations, ballots back through the machines. Each one of these poll workers is handed a stack of ballots that he is told are voted by the public during the last 3 days of early voting. Okay? Now he sits there and feeds these ballots into these machines. Okay? And we're led to believe that each one of these diligent workers, being unobserved by anybody save a guy with a camera behind a glass pane where this picture was taken from, doing his work at the scan. We're told that each one of these diligent workers knows precisely where those ballots came from. And look at them all. There's no one in that room overseeing other than people who work there. They're just scanning it one at a time. And you have 38,000 ballots to go through in a period of 3 hours. And by midnight, it's recorded that they still had somewhere on the order of 10,000 ballots to go. What is a rescanning? Hillsborough rescanning was a last-minute affair handled in the middle of the night. The press had no clue what was going on. They were taken by surprise. They could watch periodically, but that was it. Video from one of the news stations shows the ballots being rushed into the Supervisor of Elections Annex, taken out of the personal vehicles of the elections workers. No guards, no official vehicles. Now the significance of his remark about car troubles comes into play. Is it crazy to think that the ballots were swapped out? In 2009, shortly after being elected and cleaning up the mess from her predecessor, Buddy Johnson, the Supervisor of Elections of Hillsborough County, Phyllis Busanski, was presented with a box found in a warehouse containing 440 voted ballots from the previous election. These ballots, had they actually been counted as they should have been, it would have changed the result in at least one city council race. In 2009, Busanski found more irregularities with her Republican predecessor's work. It can be detailed here. There was an FBI investigation. There were millions of dollars mishandled, to say the least. Okay? Ms. Busanski was found dead June 23, 2009. She was 72 and in seemingly good condition before she died, according to those close to her. That's from the St. Petersburg Times. She was found dead on her hotel room floor during a conference for supervisors of elections in St. Augustine. Now that's fact, okay? And that's very strange. Oh, but it's not an episode of Matlock. Newspapers, officials strained to explain how her death wasn't mysterious, how it was just a coincidence. This is, after all, not an episode of Matlock. People who found it funny and remarked as much on the websites and the blogs were told to take their tinfoil hats off. But not being an episode of Matlock, of course, isn't an explanation. It's a brush-off or a suspiciously timed death, to say the least. Convenient for those she was investigating. It was attributed to natural causes because she did have a small cancerous tumor removed from her lung in 2007 that wasn't serious enough to require any chemotherapy, and that's from the St. Pete Times. Charlie Crist, instead of replacing her with another Democrat, as she was voted in 2008 as a Democrat, he replaced her with Earl Leonard, a Republican. Although a former school superintendent, he had no experience with elections and was not altogether computer savvy. He's probably one of the first people that will say, I'm not an expert in this stuff. Earl Leonard is approaching 70 years. He seems like a very nice man. Personally, my take on it is I don't think he frankly knows his business. I don't think he has the expertise to know if somebody in that office were stealing elections in front of him. I don't think he's got it. All one big game of dominoes. I've heard it said that what happens in Hillsborough County's elections offices it serves the citizens of Hillsborough County, and I shouldn't meddle there. Been told this over anonymous posts. Okay, when 38,000 ballots are tainted across the state, I might as well be dropping my vote down a well 162 feet deep with a massive hole in the bottom. Okay, so votes are a fungible commodity, and positive votes, just as negative votes, can move around the system. The way a stolen election might work is negative votes are reverberated around the system electronically after being introduced at one location. The numbers are balanced out during the evening to achieve a desired result. So you'd have to have somebody on one end of the whole system who would be willing to swap out some ballots because of the situation in 2007. In 2000, Volusia County, for instance, the 16,022 negative votes were recorded at a single polling precinct, 216, that has just under 600 registered voters. So you had someone voting negative 16,022 times for Al Gore in a location where there are only 600 registered voters expected at that precinct. So Stephen Hawking couldn't explain this one. And in my book, I describe this as the Volusia County quantum wormhole event. Okay, why Volusia was caught? Volusia was caught because a reporter made a specific inquiry into the numbers from Volusia County. An innocent poll worker reported the result as it was. This snapshot showed Bush beating Gore by a significant margin when only moments prior the reverse was true. Without this snapshot, this error might never have been detected. We now have a central database to monitor elections in real time. So they take all the information, all the data from all over the state, and run it through a central system. And they can see where the election is going, how many votes are lacking, how many votes are needed for one candidate. This was also done in Ohio in 2004. There's a capability of producing a mirror site to this, so and they'll couch it this way, so that if one goes down, the other remains up. This was done in 2004 in Ohio, unbeknownst to most voters. It is believed votes were introduced at this mirror site, which was in Tennessee, and the election was stolen for George Bush over John Kerry in Ohio. And there was a mysterious death in that case as well. We don't know if Phyllis V. Sands